Well, I'm excited about today's lesson. It's different. I'm a little giddish, actually. It sounds kind of funny, but it's so timely to me. I get out of my preacher's box, as it were, and get to explore, just stretch things out just a little bit. But, this is a presidential election year, and so we will determine who will be our president, our vice president. There will also be a lot of changes done in the Congress with the senators and the House of Representatives. So it's a big year, and the reason I'm saying that is because this is where our lesson is going today. We talked a couple of weeks back about doubting, and John the Baptist doubting who Jesus was. Are you the one, or should we look for someone else? And we saw how we doubt. And Jesus said that John the Baptist was the greatest person ever born of women, right? So, that's all of us. So he's the greatest person ever born of women. And so if the greatest person ever born struggles with doubting, then there is no doubt that I'm going to doubt, right? I'm going to doubt, and so are you. So we looked at that, what causes us to doubt and why we doubt. And then last week, we looked at how Jesus dealt with John during his time of doubting. How did Jesus handle it? And one of the things that Jesus did was give him this big warning. He says, blessed is the person who doesn't stumble or who isn't offended by me. And that word, of course, means stumble up and trip up, and so doubting is a serious thing. We got to fight with it, work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. When we start doubting things about Jesus, we got to look at that thing in a serious way. But also the warning that he gave John was, don't stumble anybody else up. So we learn from that. But this time, Jesus kicks that up even more so, and he goes into this generation thing. In other words, what do you do when an entire generation doubts? How does that roll out? Why does an entire generation doubt? And when I say generation, I'm talking about a nation. Our generation is this nation, What causes an entire nation to doubt, and what are the rollouts of that? How does that work out? So we're going to be looking at that today. And I'm excited. So if you've got your MMDs, your muted mobile devices, your iPads, iPhones, your Droids, whatever, then type in Luke chapter 7, verse 29, and we'll start there. And I'm excited about what you guys are telling me about using these mobile devices, that you can do your Greek and your Hebrew right there, looking at me, and do all the different translations, and just study the Bible right there to see if I'm on it or not. And also, if you got your Bible will work just fine too. You can turn to Luke chapter 7 and verse 29. So let's read what a portion of what we're going to be looking at today. In Luke 7:29, it says this: all the people, even the tax collectors, those are the scum, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right. Now, what were Jesus' words? Jesus was talking about how great John was, but yet those that were in the kingdom of God were even greater than John. So when they heard that, then they said God's way is right. All the people did. Because they had been baptized by John. Now, what does that mean? Well, they had received John's message. They had received John's baptism. They were baptized, so John was on it. And this is what God's doing. God's did right here. But the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected. Now, I want you to say that back to me. I want you to say, the experts in the law rejected God's purpose. Would you say that back to me? The experts in the law rejected God's purpose. These are the leaders. The experts in the law rejected God's purpose for themselves because they had not been baptized by John. They were saying by not being baptized by John, John's not who he says he is. And if you say John's not who he says he is, then you're saying Jesus isn't who he says he is. Now, they're a package. If you believe in Jesus, then you've got to believe in John as the forerunner. If you believe in John as the forerunner, then you've got to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So they rejected God's purpose for them. Now, this is interesting to me because I want you to see, and again, when you put that verse back up there for me, please, I want you to put the first part back up, 29. All the people, see, there are two groups here. There's all the people, and then put the second part up. And then there's the Pharisees and the experts. So we got two groups of people here. We got these people, just the normal people, who believed God was right. And they accepted what God was doing. And they wanted God's purpose in their life. But then we got this other group of people who rejected God and said, we don't want what God wants to do. And what we don't go there. We don't believe that John's John. We don't believe that Jesus is who he says he is. And we're not going there. We don't receive that. So they rejected that. Now, this is massively, massively important. I want you to see this with me. So massively important because these experts in the law were not just spiritual leaders for this nation, for this generation. They were also political leaders. Did I say that correctly? They were not only spiritual leaders in understanding the scriptures, but they were also political leaders in directing and governing the nation itself. And so what we've got here is this situation where you've got the people wanting to receive what God was doing, but then you've got these spiritual and religious leaders, spiritual and political leaders, not wanting to do what God was doing. I know you're understanding me, whether I'm getting it all out right or not. So you got me, right? You with me? I don't need to try to say that again. But so you got it. So we got these two groups of people, and what I want you to see is that it doesn't matter what the people think. Even though they thought they wanted what God wanted, it didn't matter because the leaders didn't. We're going to work through this. And they rejected God's purpose for themselves. They were only interested in their own selves, their own greed. They were only interested in their own wants and wealth and power. They didn't care about the people. It kind of sounds kind of familiar sometimes, doesn't it, when you start talking about political things, or even preachers sometimes. So in our amazing and wonderful nation, we have these three branches of government. First of all, we've got the legislative branch, which is the Congress, of course. And in the Congress, there is the House of Representatives, and then there is the Senate. And we get to elect these people or replace those people. we get to have a voice here. And then there is the executive branch, which is made up of the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States. And again, we get to elect these people or replace these people. And they got 8 years to work their thing. And then you have this other branch, which we don't get to elect. It's the judicial branch. It's made up of the Supreme Court and the 9 judges. So they are appointed first by the president, and then looked at and investigated, and then finally approved by the Congress. So this is how our nation works, you see. And then we have a separation of church and state. In other words, and the reason, and this is all in the Constitution, what I'm sharing with you here. We have a separation of church and state, and the reason that was originally written was so the state couldn't interfere with the church. but the way it's been flipped around is now the churches are supposed to interfere with the state. But anyway, we have a separation here. They did it. The people in the generation of Jesus, they didn't have this. It was all the same. The spiritual leaders were also the political leaders. And so the way they went was the way everybody went. And even though some people, and you and I are that way, even though sometimes we don't agree, we put them there, and if that's what they say do, we may go dragging our heels, but we're going. We can't stop it because that's where our leaders are going, and so that's where we're going. And as we've looked at the scriptures and looking at Luke, we found how Jesus so detested that system. But they were the system. And where they led, the people had to go. It wasn't like they didn't have to go. They had to go. And now, you understand that I can't say a whole lot politically, right? I mean, you understand. I could get myself in trouble and get a church in trouble. And so I got to be careful, and I am. But I can talk about a generation. I can talk about a generation. And either way you think, whether you think that our nation is doing really well and on the right track and going down the right road, or whether you have an opposite view and you think it's not doing well at all and it's going the wrong way, I think we can still agree on this fact, on this particular thought, that our experts, our leaders, have or have not rejected God's purpose for themselves. Do you agree with that? That if we're going in the right direction, then those that are going in the right direction have received God's purpose, and those that are leading us in the wrong direction have not received God's purpose for themselves. Do we kind of agree on that? Okay, good. All right. I don't know. You're looking at me really funny. But it makes a huge difference, not only what our spiritual leaders believe, but also what our national political leaders believe. Because together, these determine where you and I go, but not just where our generation goes, but where our children are going, and where our grandchildren are going, and where our great-grandchildren are going. So this is amazingly important. And if our leaders are rejecting God's purpose for themselves, then what is our generation going to leave to the next generation? Because you see, we're not really interested in all of this. Christians are known just not to care about the political situation. We kind of back off from it and we neglect it. But what I'm going to show you today is that eventually somebody's going to pay. What happens? Let me use the national debt right now. Our nation is in an unbelievable $16 trillion in debt. I don't know what that means. $16 trillion. Will we ever pay that back? What I have done is I'm heaping this on my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and on generations to come. They got to handle this. Now, that's in the natural. Let's take that now and put that in the spiritual. Because the spiritual thing still piles up. There's a debt that's owed for going in the wrong direction, which we call sin, and it piles up too. And eventually it's got to be paid. Can we ever pay back what we owe in the spiritual dimension? And so as we're looking at this, I want you to see what I'm trying to communicate with you. So the next verse, after it says that those experts did not receive what God wanted to do in their lives, the purposes of God, the next verse, Jesus says this, 7:31. To what then can I compare the people of this generation? What this nation is made up of right now. What can I compare these people to? Now, a couple of things here while we're looking at that. First of all, it's people. A lot of times we Bible people, we want to think of a generation in just years, 40 years or whatever a generation might work out to you. And so we want to think of it that way. But no, what Jesus says specifically here, the people. What can I compare? The people. These are real people. Just like you and I are real people. We're in a generation, but we're really real. And we're affected by our leaders. He says, so what can I compare the people of this generation? What are they, real people, what are they like? And he says this, a fascinating passage. They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not cry. This is interesting, so interesting. Now, fascinating passage, and it gives us Jesus' assessment of his own generation. It says this generation. It means Jesus' own generation. He's assessing his generation, but it also lets us know that he assesses every generation. How does he assess our generation? And so Jesus said a tremendous amount his generation. We're going to look at some of them, and as we go through them, I want you to compare what he was seeing in his generation with what we see in our generation, and then let's figure this thing out together. Luke 9:41 says this. Jesus, speaking about his generation, says, "O unbelieving and perverse generation." He says his generation is an unbelieving and a perverse generation. So how does our generation align with that? Has there ever been a more unbelieving or a more perverse generation than our generation? I don't know. In America, I don't think so. It's piling up. It's like it gets worse and worse. How do we compare here? And then Luke 11:29, and many of these are Luke in our future, as we move through this book of Luke, we're going to have to look at these things. So I'm kind of laying a foundation here for us so that when we get there, we'll have something, our heads wrapped around something. In 11:29, it says, as the crowds increased, this is so interesting. As the crowds increased, Jesus said, this is a wicked generation. They're coming to Jesus to hear him teach and preach and heal. And he still says they're wicked. People go to church, and they go to church and act like everything's fine, but are we wicked? Some of the most wicked people I know go to church. I know you don't want to say that. Nobody's here like that, but there really are people like that. How do we compare here? Luke 11:50. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible, look, for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world. Let's go ahead and read verse 51, the very next verse. Yes, I tell you, Jesus says, yes, I tell you, this generation, my generation, will be held responsible for it all. What does that mean? Well, that generation is going to have to pay the price. All the other generations built a bed up, but now somebody's going to pay it. It's coming down, and it's coming down on that generation. And he's talking about blood. How do you pay for blood? More blood. It's going to be bad on that generation. Luke 17:25. But first he, this is talking about the Son of Man. We're going to be talking about the Son of Man in a second. That's the context. But first he, Son of Man, must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation, by his generation. It's like the final nail in the coffin. Once this happens, boom. Matthew 23:36. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this, his generation. All what? If you read back, what you'll see is he's condemned them. He's called them a bunch of vipers and snakes and a generation of them. And then he says, how will you escape the damnation of hell? And then he says that. That's what's all coming upon that generation. All this will come upon this generation. See, all judgment's going to come down on a generation at some point in some time. Matthew 24:34. And this is the last one we'll read. This is plenty. This generation, his generation, will certainly not pass until all these things have happened. What's he saying? In your lifetime, imminent, before you die, this is going to happen to your generation. So, as we evaluated, how is our generation and our nation aligning with what Jesus was condemning that generation over and about? How are we lining up? See, what he said about it as he assessed that was it was a perverse generation, an unbelieving generation, a wicked generation, a rejecting God's messenger generation, a rejecting him generation, an imminent doom generation. What's he assessing about our generation? We can see the national financial debt, but what is the spiritual debt that's one day is going to have to be paid with blood? So Jesus said, to what can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? So then he says this, Luke 7:32. They are like children sitting in the marketplace. We're reading it again. And calling out to each other. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance, and we sang a dirge, and you did not cry. What? What does that mean? How do we get something out of this? Well, that's what I do. This is why I'm here. See, Jesus gave us an illustration. It's actually two illustrations of what people did, and we did it as children, and they did it as children. It's play grown up. It's you pretend grown up. And so he gives two illustrations here. One is a playing of a flute, and it's a wedding pretending. They're pretending wedding. It's a happy time, dancing time. And then the other illustration that he gives is the total opposite, which is a funeral. pretend. Let's pretend funeral. Children pretending funeral. They sang a dirge, a sad song, and everybody should cry. So Jesus says that's what you're like. You're like these kids, like this. So let's work it out here. So we're children, and we want to play wedding. So you be the husband, and you be the wife, and you can be the maid of honor, and you can be the best man, and you guys can be the grooms of honor, and grooms, and you can be the matrons of honor, and everybody else will just be that. We'll need an officiant. You can be the preacher, and I'll get a flute, and I'll play a happy song, and we'll have this wedding, and then we'll dance. We'll all dance. And so this is what he's saying. This is we're going to play wedding. So Jesus invites everybody to come play, and nobody wants to play. Nobody wants to pretend with you. No. We want to do our own thing. We reject what you want to do. We want to do our own thing. We want to be in control. We want to decide what we play, what we do, what we pretend, what we get involved in. Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's play something else. How about we play funeral? If you don't want to play happy song, let's play sad song. We'll go over here and we'll do something really, really sad. If you don't want to be happy, we'll do this. We'll have a funeral. We'll play funeral. Okay, let's play funeral. Let's work that out. Okay. You be the officiant, and you be the dead guy, and you be the pallbearers, and you guys be the pallbearers, and you guys be the you be the you girls you be the mourners. And the rest of us, I'll be the procession. And then we'll sing a dirge. And we'll all cry. That's what you do at funerals. Okay, we'll play that. No, we don't play that. Jesus says, well, you won't play, you won't pretend this with me, and you won't get involved in this with me. I can't make you happy. This is what this generation is like. You're like a bunch of obstinate, spoiled brats. If you don't get your way, you just take your toy and go home. You won't play. You won't get involved here. You want to have it your own way. You reject everything that I'm wanting to do, and you're just brats. You just spoil up. If you don't get your way, you lay on the floor and kick and have a temper tantrum, and you just show off. This is what he's saying. I can't make you happy. You won't participate in the happy time, and you won't participate in the sad time. And no matter what we attempt to do to include you, you won't involve yourself. You won't get in it. And they rejected God's purpose for themselves. All they wanted to do was for themselves, their own gain. They wanted to run the show. They wanted it their way. They wanted everything to work out for them, for their good. It doesn't work that way. You wanted to pretend. We wanted to pretend something with you. We wanted to get you involved, but you had nothing to do with it. You wouldn't dance and you wouldn't sing. So what's Jesus really getting to here? He's comparing this generation. So let's let him explain it to us, what he's really saying here. So Jesus says this generation is like spoiled, crabby, rebellious brats. He says that's what he's saying, and then he explains it. 7:33. For John the Baptist came, neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. So this is the sad song. This is the dirge. This is John the Baptist came wanting everybody to cry and repent. He preached death. He preached the axe is laid at the root of the tree, and all the chaff is going to be burned up, and you better repent and you better cry. It's the sad song. So John came with that, and he says, you wouldn't participate with John. You wouldn't get involved with John. We invited you, but you rejected John's baptism. You rejected John. You wouldn't cry with John. He goes on. Now let me explain that before we put that verse up there. See, let me say, eventually what happened, though the people went out to see John. We just saw that the Pharisees and the experts rejected John. So eventually what the experts did was convince the people that John had a demon. Listen, anybody that eccentric can't be of God. Anybody that lives in the wilderness, totally separated from society, eating bugs and honey, totally away from everybody, they got to have a demon. And you don't want to follow somebody with a demon, do you? And so they persuaded the people to believe that John had a demon. So Jesus says this in Luke 7:34. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. You don't want a drunk leading you, do you? You don't want a glutton leading you, do you? And so they worked on convincing Jesus was hung around with the wrong people and was influenced by them, and he was a drunk. Now, I want you to see something here. Would you put that back up for me, please, at 7:34? See, what he says is he doesn't say here, Jesus didn't say, I, Jesus, came eating and drinking. What does he say? The Son of Man came eating and drinking. And what does that mean? Okay, take it down. What does that mean? So we don't know. And Jesus never called himself Jesus. He didn't walk up to people and say, hey, I'm Jesus. He said, who do people say I, the Son of Man, am? Every time Jesus referenced himself, it was as the Son of Man. 80-something times in your New Testament, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. But what does that mean? Well, it means a lot when you're wanting to understand what this works out into our lives and into their lives and understanding the Testament. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and try to get our heads wrapped around this Son of Man thought. So we'll get it because they got it. They knew what he was saying. So let's go back. Where is Jesus referencing? Where does this Son of Man thing come from? Well, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13 and 14. Let me read it to you. In my vision, Daniel's having a vision, and it's at night. I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man. This is Jesus' reference, and you'll see why. Watch this. Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Acts 1:9 talks about Jesus ascending in the clouds. So Daniel is seeing this way before it happened. Seeing this happen, Jesus ascending in the clouds. He approached the Ancient of Days, of course, Father God, and was led into his presence. Now, we can read about this in Revelation chapter 5, where the Lamb that was slain is brought into the presence before the throne and receives the scroll that's written within and without. He receives that scroll, and then all of heaven worships him, and then he receives his kingdom, and after that, as he starts opening the scroll, all the horsemen, the apocalyptic horsemen, start riding out, all the trumpets sound, all the vials are poured out. And this is what Daniel's talking about. He's talking about this guy coming into the presence. He was given authority. Okay, let's put it back up. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. That's what Revelation 5 is talking about. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. That will what? Not pass away. And the kingdom, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed, never end. So this is Jesus. We know that this is Jesus. He is the Son of Man. He's receiving his messianic authority. He's receiving his kingdom that will never pass away, that will never be destroyed. And I think we got that. Now, you may not have ever come at it that way, but this is the origin of the Son of Man. It's the messianic Messiah, the King, who has received his kingdom. And Jesus says the Son of Man came, and you say he's the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say. So I just wanted to hook it up. Okay, Delbert, we got that he's the king and all that stuff, but how does that link into this generation thing? Okay, this is what I'm working on now. Matthew 16:27. Are you ready? The Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels. When the angels are coming with him, it's judgment. I'll show you more about that in just a second. And then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, verily, verily. Some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Let's leave it up there. What does this mean? We are traditionally taught that a lot of things, events have to yet happen before this can happen. But Jesus said here, talking to his disciples, this is going to happen in your lifetime. This is going to happen before you die. This is going to happen imminently. This will happen before you die. Now, either that's what that means, or we got some 2,000-year-old dudes walking around. The coming of the Son of Man with his angels is his coming in judgment. And this coming judgment that Jesus is talking about would happen in their lifetime. The scrolls of Revelation are opened, and the horses ride out, and all of these vials and stuff are he says, are going to take place in their lifetime. If I'm on track here. It was a horrific time. Now, I'm going to read you this. Just go ahead and put it up. Matthew 24:21. Now, this is a long, long passage here. It's this whole chapter is this. And so I've selected just a couple of verses, all in context, to just show you what it's saying here. So I'll tell you where I'm at as I read. First of all, it's Matthew 24, verse 21. It says here, "For then shall be great tribulation." We've heard about the great tribulation. It's going to happen. It's what we're traditionally taught. The great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. No, nor ever shall be. So that's the great tribulation. Bad, bad time. Now watch. In verses 27 and 28 says this, "For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even to the west." What does that mean? It means you're not going to miss it. Just as sure as you can see lightning come across the sky, you're going to see this. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. What we're talking about. All right? Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. We can read about that in the book of Revelation, at Armageddon, and all of that stuff where the blood's up to the horse's bridle and the vultures, it says eagles in the King James, but the vultures come. He says, and this is verse 34, "I tell you the truth. This generation, his generation, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." All these scriptures that I just read you are in context. Now, here's the question. Did it happen? Was there this catastrophic event, lights out situation for this nation? Was it like demons being released in the land? Was it like lights out, the stars falling from heaven, moon not giving its light, sun being darkened? Was it like that? Was it lights out? Yes. I'll talk more about it at the end of our time together. But what I want us to first of all see is I'm connecting you with the Son of Man. The Son of Man is the Messiah coming in his kingdom. He's received his kingdom and he's coming. And Jesus references himself as that Son of Man, this Messiah. So now back to Luke, our study for today. Luke 7:34. The Son of Man came, eating and drinking. Now, look at it right. They didn't say you came eating and drinking. Jesus says, I did. I came. I admit it. I came eating and drinking. That's how I came. He's making a point. Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here's what they said, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So, Jesus was saying, John came this way. He came eccentric, separated from society. I didn't come that way. I came hanging out with people, having parties, going to weddings. I came being socially active. I came connecting with people. I got involved with everybody. I went to church with you, to the synagogues. I met with your leaders, your Pharisees and your Sadducees. I debated with them. I did everything that you do in society. I'm in the mainstream of society. I'm different from John. And I played for you a happy song. I played for you a good time. See, John wasn't liberal enough, and I'm too liberal. And he says, I came playing you a happy song, but you were so in your own thing you are so rejecting what God's purpose is for your life that you wouldn't dance with me. You wouldn't cry with John, and you won't dance with me. You're just a bunch of brats. You're a bunch of spoiled, undisciplined, spoiled, rotten, obnoxious brats. Brats is what you call somebody else's children, right? But that's brats. Luke 7:35. Jesus now says this. But wisdom is proved right. Say that back to me. Wisdom is proved right. Say that. Wisdom is proved right. See, you prove wisdom. You just don't say it. You don't just say somebody's got a demon and that's wisdom. You don't just say somebody's a drunkard and a glutton and that's wisdom. That's not wisdom. Wisdom is proved right by all her children. We kind of understand this, but let's look at this definition in the Greek of wisdom. It's the Greek word sophia. And what it means is wisdom, broad and full of intelligence. We kind of got that. But here's where it starts getting good. The very knowledge of things human and divine. We could say it's the very knowledge of the natural things, the political, and also spiritual things. I'm not a wise man unless I know something about a lot of things. Unless I know a little bit about politics and I know a little bit about the government and know a little bit, and I'm really not considered wise. Not just about the Bible. And then he goes on here with, well, he doesn't go on. This is what the definition says. He goes on, skill and discretion in imparting Christian truth. Now, I want you to see that. See, it's not that I want to impart wisdom. Wisdom is imparted. It's just not spoken. A parent imparts wisdom to their children. They can tell them all day long what to do, but if they don't see the parent doing it and imparting it to them, it's not going to work. It's an impartation, wisdom is. You need to get around wise people to be wise. Imparting Christian truth. And it's the requisites of godly and upright living. Godly and upright living. It's a parent whose wisdom is proved out. Not by what the parent says, but by looking at the parent's children. You know if a parent was wise by looking at the parent's children. Are they godly? Are they godlike? Are they following the ways of God? Are they living good lives? How is their lives going? Then you can look back and say, they had good parents. They had wise parents. This is what Jesus is saying. It's proved out. It's imparted to. It's obvious. And you don't know sometimes until the next generation if it was wise or not. And this is what Jesus is saying. Wisdom, you won't know who's right here, who is really wise here, until the next generation. We'll see what happens to this generation. And he's saying here, are you guys right? Are you Pharisees and you experts? Are you the ones that are wise here? Are you the ones that are wise? Are you the ones that got the answers? Or do me and John, just John and I, were we the ones that had the answers? How did that work out? And I want to say this is that wisdom isn't proven by what you say. Wisdom is proved right by what you produce. I can sound so smart. Well, maybe I can't, but some people can sound so smart. But when you look at their lives, it's proved out. It's by what you've produced. So, who proved right here? Was it the experts and the Pharisees who rejected what God wanted to do in their lives, or was it John and Jesus? Who proved right here with wisdom? So, as I showed you, we're going to be talking more and more about the Son of Man. We're going to be talking more and more about this generation thing as we move through the book of Luke. But right now, for today, let me just tell you this, how this rolled out in this generation. In AD 66, the Jews rebelled against the Romans, and Romans were occupied right then the land of Israel. They ruled the world. And they occupied, and they rebelled, the Jews did. And in September of AD 66, the Roman armies came into an area called Megiddo. We get our thought of Armageddon from that. And these Roman armies emerged there. They came there. And led by three Roman commanders, Cestius, Vespasian, and Titus. You can look this up in your research. You can research this. And they gathered to invade Israel. And Armageddon began. And they ravaged that land. Every city was leveled. Every town, every village was leveled. Children were killed. Women were raped. Any vile thing you can imagine. It was like demons. In Revelation 9 and 10, where the scorpions come out, it's like the earth was opened and all of these vile things took place in this land. They were released. Everything was destroyed and stolen and taken. Even Jerusalem. And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 2, he says, not one stone. He says, you see these, and you see all these stones, all this temple, and one stone's not going to stand upon another. It's going to come down stone by stone. And that's exactly what happened. 100,000 people were killed, and the rest were taken into slavery and dispersed in all the world. It was lights out for that system. There's no temple. There's no animal sacrifices anymore. There's no worship there. It's lights out. It was just as Jesus said. It was great tribulation. I'll read you that again. We read it a while ago. It was great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And that generation of spoiled brats, of people that couldn't do anything that God wanted to do, but only wanted to do what they wanted to do, pitching a fit, not receiving what God wanted in their lives, spoiled brats, obnoxious, indignant brats, with specifically these leaders, led these people to doom. It was doomsday. 80, 70. They were destroyed. The bill mounted up. And eventually a generation has to pay. Eventually that generation paid. Jesus came to that generation to warn them. And they rejected God's purpose for them. God sent them John the Baptist. God sent them Jesus the Christ to try to save that generation. And they rejected him. And they let him off the cliff into doom. To what does Jesus compare our generation? What are we like? What does he see when he assesses us? Our leaders. What does he say about us? Upon what generation will the bill come? Who's going to have to pay? Will it be us? Who's going to spill the blood? Will it be our children? Will it be our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? But eventually, unless we get right, payday's coming. When our leaders reject God's purpose for themselves, it only means they're interested in their own purposes. And so we in our amazing nation have an input. We get to select the president, the person who leads us. The way the Constitution is written out is so beautiful. They get to serve 8 years, most, unless they're not doing well. Then we have the Congress and the Senate, and the House of Representatives. We get to put them there or take them out. I really hear God saying, listen, folks, this is serious. We need to know whether our leaders are really wanting God's purpose for themselves. Or are they rejecting God's purpose for themselves? And I know it's not fun having to watch politics. I know. But you owe it to your children. You owe it to your grandchildren because wisdom is proved out through its children. What will our children say about us? Will they say, my father or my grandfather or my great-grandfather was wise? Or will they say, they were dumb as dirt? They let all this happen to us. And now we're paying. So the good side is this. Every 2 years, we get to do something about it. Every 2 years, we get to elect congressmen and senators, right? And every 4 years, we get to take a look at the president and the vice president. So this year, we're going to get to look at all of them. And so I'm just putting this question on you. I can't say any more than that. But you got to look. And you got to know who your representatives and your senators are, and you got to know stuff because it's the president and the vice president will be electing are keeping this year, and it's the senators or the congressmen we're going to be replacing or keeping this year. You need to know. So what Jesus is saying is this is massively important. Don't just scrub it off as a generation as just a bunch of years. You're the generation. How wise are we? Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. You challenge us. You make us expand. You force us to look at things. Father, I pray that we'll look at our experts. Where are they taking us? They're taking us somewhere. Whether we want to go or not, they're taking us. So, Father, I ask you to help us. Let us know what to do. Let us become more and more involved. Let us be wise about this stuff. Not just wise about the Bible, but wise about natural things as well. Make us wise, Lord, so we can prove out that we are wise through our children, and through our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. And I ask you to bless us. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Heads bowed and eyes closed. Just ask you, some of you know you're not where you need to be with the Lord. I'm telling you, it's a bad place to be. You're rejecting God's purpose for your life. And that's bad. That's doom in and of itself. You are heading for bad stuff. And so the Lord's just asking you today, you came in here knowing that you're not where you need to be. God wants you to accept and receive His purpose for your life. So if that's you, and you know you're not where you need to be, would you, with just me looking, you just slip your hand up right where you're saying and just say, pray for me. I want to be where I'm supposed to be with the Lord. See a hand here. Any others? Hand in the back there. Any others? Just quickly.